Hi, and welcome to Journey Forward with Jory Rose, where you will gain insights, tools, and inspiration to get unstuck and live your best life. Jory is a licensed marriage and family therapist with a passion for helping people cultivate awareness and authenticity so they can show up fully in all aspects of their life. And now, here's Jory.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Journey Forward with Jory Rose. Today I'm going to be talking about suicide. Hopefully this episode can bring you some insight and tools and greater understanding of how to process, cope, talk about when someone you know or even someone you don't know, such as in the recent finding of the news that Stephen Twitch boss recently committed suicide. Even as a celebrity, he is someone we felt like we all knew in a variety of different capacities. So whether it's someone you know, someone you feel like you knew, or someone you don't know, in this episode, I'm going to be going over some ways to process it, ways to communicate about it, especially if there's children in your life that you're wanting to talk to about something as complex and challenging and difficult as suicide. And I'm also going to be sharing my own story. So if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you may have heard me talk about that my own father committed suicide when I was 10. And I'm going to share some more vulnerable and reveal some more information that I'm not sure I've ever revealed on the podcast, but I'm really feeling compelled to share with you all now. And this wasn't the episode I was planning to release this point in the holiday season. This wasn't my intention, but it was definitely a call in response to what has occurred that I know across my entire social media and articles that I'm seeing and conversations that I'm having with the recent news of Twitch having taken his own life. One of the biggest and most challenging questions that seems impossible to have an answer to is, why would somebody who seemingly had such a great life, was successful, had a beautiful family, really seemed to have it all: the career, the fame, the fortune, the money, or we are presuming all of these things, of course, but this is what we see when we're taking an outside look into someone's life. For what we could tell of what we knew of Twitch, and in all the memorial responses I've seen from people who knew him and people who didn't know him, one of the most consistent things is he was such a bright light. He brought so much joy to everyone around him. And you look at his social media or his wife Allison's social media, and you see videos of them dancing and with their children and feeling connected and in love. And how is that the profile of someone who chooses to take their own life? And I think this comes up against one of the very biggest challenges with suicide is we may never have those answers. Even information that may be revealed in a suicide note may not give us the complete answer to the depth of the question of, why did this happen? And our minds are meaning-making machines. So we're going to constantly try to make sense out of something that feels senseless. And there is so much emotion that comes up around suicide: devastation, shock, surprise, confusion, fear, anxiety, grief, immense grief, sadness, anger, more confusion. And as any moment in life, and being a marriage and family therapist and a life coach, I, of course, am always teaching my clients about managing their emotions and gaining greater access to understand their emotions and having more accurate language to label and name their emotions. So, as I always say, there is no such thing as a negative emotion. They are all natural emotions. And as any moment we are dealing with in life, we often have competing emotions, meaning we might be feeling a lot of different things at the exact same time. And whenever we are overwhelmed and taken over in emotion, one of the very best things you can do about it is feel it. The more you try to deny, resist, ignore, dismiss, justify away, push it aside, push it under the rug, it doesn't go anywhere. It's going to get stuck. So, whatever it is that you're feeling, whether it's about Twitch's suicide or whether it's whatever is arising in your life, your best strategy of moving through what feels unbearable is to lean in. Allow yourself to feel it. Oftentimes, when we are experiencing very heavy emotions, grief, sadness, despair, even anger, confusion, one of the challenges of being in the midst of this emotional experience is it feels like it's never going to end. And the fear that this emotion and this feeling and this experience in your mind is never going to end often intensifies our experience of that emotion. And yet the irony is when you allow yourself to lean in and to feel it and to not be afraid of feeling, the irony is the emotion passes maybe a little bit easier, with a little bit more grace, with a little bit more self-compassion. You're going to be able to ride the waves of emotions. So I know I'm talking more broadly for the moment about how to manage difficult emotions and when emotions feel confusing and overwhelming. But in specific relation to suicide, there is a certain set of emotions that feel like nothing else I can compare it to. So before I jump into my own story, I want to be mindful and really set my bias for the remainder of this conversation that there is often a rhetoric that suicide is selfish. And I saw a lot of posts about this across my social media the past few days, feeling that, isn't it selfish that maybe you are relieving your own pain, your own suffering, but what about the people you've left behind? Being the daughter of someone who died by suicide, believe me, and I'm going to go into a little bit more, I know what happens to the family, to the children of the person who's decided to end their own life. And because I am one of these people, I have had a front row seat to this tragic experience. Let me tell you, it is the least selfish thing that I can think of. And here's why. I, gratefully so, have never been in a position in which I thought that death was a better option than life. Even people who experience very deep depression, who are going through trauma in their life, maybe they've never even come close to the thought that I'd rather end it, because oftentimes, and especially in the work that I do, what I do hear people say is, I want the pain to end. But ending the pain and ending your life are two very different things. We've all been in situations and experiences in which we've experienced pain or trauma or heartache or despair. in which we wanted it to end. And traditionally, if someone says to somebody else, I can't take it anymore, I want to end my life, the person who's talking about it generally is not the one who's going to act on it. I know that's a big generalization. In the mental health field, it tends to be a trend that if someone is communicating about their despair or depression or their belief that there is no choice but to end their life, generally the ones talking about it don't. That's not to say that it still doesn't happen, but I want to point out that we don't easily know what is going on in people's worlds. We don't always know how they're feeling on the inside. And even when they could be living a life that on the outside looks happy and peaceful and joyful or abundant, the big paradox of life is that there still could be an and of what they're experiencing internally. So I invite you to not make judgments on someone who has made the choice to end their life, because likely you've never been in that position. I have never been in the shoes of someone who was moments away from choosing life or death. And for that, I am grateful. But if you have not been in that position, then we have no right to judge their choice. We don't know exactly what's going on for someone who is in a suicidal state. They likely are not thinking clearly. There could be other factors going on that prohibit clear thinking. But I just want to invite the compassion rather than judgment. I always say the opposite of judgment is compassion. So if you or anyone else that you know begins to feel judgmental towards a person who has made a choice to end their own life and say that was so selfish of them, I invite you to choose compassion instead. Compassion would say, I have no idea what they must have been going through, to which this felt like the only solution. And for that, we can hold compassion. I was, just like many of you probably listening, absolutely devastated to hear that Twitch had died. I made an assumption he was a happy person. With that, I made an assumption that meant mental stability. And I immediately went to compassion for what I didn't know, to what was arising in his internal world, whether for moments, for days, for weeks, for months, for years. We just don't know. And what I really have a lot of compassion and I'm holding an immense amount of space for is his family and his children, because that I do know what it's like. So I know I've said that I've talked a little bit about my father's suicide, but I'm going to go in a little bit further here and share my story. And I hope that in listening to my story, you can, I don't know, learn some insights or tools of how to talk about, communicate about, relate to, stay aware of whenever suicide impacts your life, your community. So my dad died when I was about 10, and my parents had been divorced for many years at that point. And at that time in my life, we lived in different parts of the state. So I really only saw him a couple times a year. And I remember the previous winter break, before he died, I was staying at his house, and being the curious little kid that I was, had opened up his nightstand drawer one night or one day. I was being curious and I saw a gun inside. I had never seen a gun before and it freaked me out. I didn't know what to do about it. And in my freaked out state, I didn't even tell anybody what I had seen. I didn't talk about it. I just held it in and didn't know how to make sense of it. And 4.5 months later, on a very significant day, and I say significant because I remember the details of this day perfectly. The irony is, I remember our very last conversation. I remember where I was standing. I remember what we talked about. And I remember the entire details of the next day. It was my spring break. I was at an amusement park with my friends. I was trying to get a hold of my mom all day because my overprotective mom always wanted me to check in with her. And I was supposed to call her via using a calling card from a payphone. And I had done that many times before and I knew how to do that. And that particular day, it wasn't working. And I was never able to get through to my mom. And it was always interesting to me because I remember that day worrying about it, worrying that she was worrying about me because I never was able to get a hold of her. Obviously, this was way before cell phones. And I was coming back to my friend's house that evening and was supposed to spend the night with my group of friends. And my mom had called my friend's mom and said that I couldn't sleep over and that I had to come home, and I didn't understand why. And this friend of mine lived really close to me, maybe a mile and a half. And I can still picture it perfectly. My brother was with my mom when she came to pick me up. And strangely enough, he was driving the car and she was sitting in the back seat. So right off the bat, I knew something was different, something was off. And in the few-minute drive it took us to get back home, my mom had said the words to me, "Daddy did something to make himself die." And the first thing I thought about was the image that I had in my head of the gun I had seen in his nightstand drawer just 4 months earlier. And because I had seen a gun, I didn't feel compelled to ask, how did he die? What did he do? The only question I asked was why. And there's no answer. There was no easy answer to why. And even though my dad had left a note, it doesn't explain really the why. I can presume the why. I can make some assumptions about the why, but I'm not sure any of us really know. And for years, so I was 10 years old at the time. It wasn't until I was in my mid-30s when I happened to see my dad's death certificate, in which I read the words, "gunshot wound inflicted to the head." No one had ever actually said the words to me. And no one ever asked me what I thought. It was a very strange, bizarre, non-communicated thing. And I think this speaks to the shame that can come up around a family who's dealing with suicide. But I also think it speaks to there's just no easy words to communicate about this. And I always had the assumption of what I knew had happened. I had heard some more broad details, but it wasn't until over 25 years later that I saw his death certificate, when I actually saw the words, that it was confirmed for me how he died. But there has never been an easy answer to the question of why. And that's something that survivors of suicide have to be okay being in the unknown, in the not knowing, but in the making sense that for whatever reason, this felt like a better option. And I did have my suspicions as to the why. And I think my dad was in some financial trouble. And I know that he had changed his life insurance policy soon before he had died, which his friends, who were also executors of his will, knew that he made that change. And they didn't see it as a red flag. And for years, and probably still to this day, almost 35 years later, kick themselves of, I should have known. If I would have known, maybe there is something I could have done. And I think this is one of the questions that haunts people who have been affected by suicide, is the not knowing. What could I have done to maybe have stopped it? If I only knew more of the level of despair, depression, or angst that this person was living in, could I have prevented this from happening? And just like almost any what if question, what ifs only cause us more anxiety because we'll never know. And the more we spin on the what could I have done, if only I would have known, there'd be a different outcome. Maybe that's true, and maybe it's not. I do know this. My dad was in financial trouble, and as a result of his death via his life insurance policy, I was able to be taken care of in a way that I've always been grateful for. And none of that replaces the opportunity of having a father to grow up with. And so I am stuck with probably my biggest life paradox of not grateful he died. I don't think there's any gratitude in that. Grateful that if he was unable to care for me and my siblings in a way that he couldn't do while alive, he ensured care for us in his death. But I have never, ever, ever seen his act as selfish. And ironically, I have struggled in relationships with abandonment issues, wanting to make sure someone is always there for me. And psychoanalytics might say, oh, well, your father chose to, quote, leave you, so no wonder you have abandonment issues. But when I think about him, I don't think about abandonment. I don't think that he did this to me. I don't think that he chose death over living with me and experiencing life with my siblings and I actually have a lot of peace around that. I don't feel like he chose to leave me in a way that for me felt I needed to take that personally. And maybe as you're listening, you may not be able to understand that, or maybe some people do. But I've always felt like he did what he had to do for him. And who am I to judge that? I cannot like it. I can be angry about it. I can be sad about it. I can have grief over that. But judging it, that was one that I personally never experienced. And I think this is one of the complexities around suicide, is there's no right or wrong way to feel or to experience whatever it is you're experiencing or feeling. It's an opportunity to hold the dialectical of two truths. There are multiple truths at once. There's not one truth that needs to be more right than the other. They all can exist at the same time. That's just the paradox of life and the paradox of emotions. And I have always found some peace in knowing that whatever suffering he was suffering, that his death alleviated his suffering. And for that, I can be grateful. And there's so much I can say about this. The amount of chaos that it does leave behind can be unbearable. Because anytime someone passes away, there's always a lot of logistics to manage. It often prolongs grief, it prolongs the mourning process because there's funeral arrangements, there's financial arrangements, there's logistics of property and home and belongings to take care of. And suicide complicates the natural mourning and grief period because of the complexity of emotions that are present. And in my personal experience, the amount of chaos that was left behind was significant, and it lasted for years. And even still, in my young mind, I never judged and never even really got angry about his choice. That being said, there is an enormous amount of something I did carry for a long time. It wasn't judgment, but what it was shame. There are very few people who knew the actual story of how my dad died for many, many, many years. What I used to say was something that brought me greater ease, which was to say he died of heart problems, which wasn't untrue. My dad had had 2 heart attacks. He very easily could have died of a 3rd heart attack. I was too embarrassed to express my truth because I had a fear that it would reflect negatively upon me. I'm not really sure how, but I was fearful of people judging me for my father's choice. And it was probably not until my mid-30s that I could say with great ease, I'm not sure ease is the right word, maybe self-compassion is an easier word, that I didn't feel shame. And till I had developed my own sense of self to recognize that his choices did not reflect upon me and that I had nothing to be embarrassed about. His choices, his mental health, whether it was whatever led him to that moment, was not a reflection of me. And it took 20 to 25 years for me to be able to name that. And now that I am in the mental health field, I have dealt with clients who have dealt with suicide and who have dealt with family members or friends who've committed suicide. I've dealt with those who have been suicidal. And I am grateful that I do have firsthand experience of understanding the complexity of emotions because I think it deepens my own awareness and self-compassion to be able to communicate about it. I wish I didn't have that knowledge, but I do. And it's also given me some different language to be able to guide others in healing around it. So I want to be able to give you some insight into some ways to talk to people who are going through it with a family member, a loved one, a friend, someone in your community. And the very, very first thing that I want to say is be very mindful to not make assumptions on what you thought someone's life was like. I think this is a disservice, especially to the family and friends of the person who has died, because we don't always know what someone's internal world is. And yet, we're trying to make sense of something that feels senseless. How do we understand what we can't understand? Because we're not in that situation. We were not in that person's experience. And it feels like a big, vast emptiness of an unknown to try to navigate through. So, the first thing that I offer is not making assumptions. Oh, but they were so happy. Oh, they had so much going for them. Oh, I just saw them the other day and everything seemed fine. Be really, really mindful of assumptions. And on the heels of that, be very mindful to not make judgments. Because what that person needs most in their memory, in talking about them, is compassion. Compassion for the suffering that we might not have known they were in, and a lot of compassion for those who were survived by the person who has passed. And this is a really hard topic, and I've dealt with suicide actually a couple of more times in my life. About 12 years ago, a very close family friend of mine who was actually part of my family during the time that my dad died, he also committed suicide. And that was one that was really difficult for me to make sense of, because he was there and he saw the aftermath of what my family went through, of the chaos and the not just the grief of my dad dying, but the logistical nightmare that it can easily put families into. So part of me was really surprised that he had chosen to make that choice, knowing very well firsthand from a front row seat the aftermath of suicide. And yet again, if I believe that, well, he saw the chaos, how could he have done that? Well, that to me is a judgment. And so I very quickly go to compassion to say, I don't know what it was like for him to be living to where the only belief that relief was in death. Prior to that close family friend of mine, my senior year of high school, on Labor Day weekend, only about after a week or so of school starting, one of my classmates who I had known all through high school, middle school, actually went out with him for a few weeks in 7th grade, he committed suicide beginning of senior year. And that affected our entire school community. His younger sister was a freshman. He was a senior. He was well known. So almost everyone in the school had some connection to either him or his sister. And the amount of grief was palpable walking through our school halls. And the double amount of grief because his own father had committed suicide the same way only a few years earlier. So the immense trauma that his mother and sister to continue with, I can only imagine. And I've over the years thought about them and sent them so much loving kindness and compassion for the trauma that suicide can bring. It's a really, really, really hard thing to understand. And the best thing we can do is to find the language to communicate about it. When you feel like you don't have the right words to talk about it, one of my favorite things is to say when you don't know what to say, to simply say, I don't know what to say. That's being honest, that's being authentic. You don't have to have all the answers to be able to hold the space. And the language around how to make sense of it. Again, we never know what it's like to be in someone's shoes the moment before they decide to literally or figuratively pull the trigger. And I invite anyone who is feeling this confusion for whether it's a public death or someone in your own life, or even if it was something in your past, we can spend years making ourselves crazy around how do I live in the not knowing? And one of the ways to comfort ourselves in the not knowing is to be in acceptance. And oftentimes people think that to accept something means you have to like it. Well, accepting it doesn't mean you like it, it just means you stop resisting it. And when we can stop resisting the thought of, I don't know why someone made this choice, then perhaps we might have an easier time grieving and a greater ability to access the compassion that that person really requires. They don't need our understanding. That's our ego trying to make sense of something that we can't fathom. And be grateful you can't fathom it if you haven't been in that position. And if you have been in the position of contemplation of suicide, I invite you to utilize the resources of not just 911, but 988, which is a new mental health hotline, which can provide a little bit more mental and emotional support through trained people rather than a emergency response. And I'm grateful that there is a need that we have seen as a society to offer more emergency mental and emotional support for our health in those moments. And if you are someone who has contemplated suicide, who is in a situation that feels unbearable, I don't want to be cliche to say the pain can end through gaining support, through talking about it, through getting out of a situation that is perhaps contributing to the despair. I know it's not easy, and it's possible because the pain isn't necessarily permanent, but the choice of suicide is. And I know that since COVID, the anxiety and depression rates have gone from like an average of 11% up to almost 40%. So we are living in a society and culture in which we are navigating mental health challenges on a much more significant level than collectively I think we ever have before. And so what can you do? Well, be kind. Be mindful of judgments and assumptions you make on others regarding any aspect of their life, but especially mental and emotional health. Ask questions, inquire about people, ask how they're doing without the obligatory fine, how are you response, but really get curious. How are you really doing? What's really going on? How can I be there for you? What support do you need right now? Do you need me just to listen? Can I help you solve a problem? Can I help you create change? Can I help you gain access to greater support? What is it you're feeling? What is it you need? These are some questions that we can begin to feel more comfortable leaning into, because sometimes we don't reach out to people who are needing our support because we are uncomfortable. We don't know what to say. We don't know what to do with their response. But not asking doesn't make it all go away. It just masks it, pushes it under the rug. And you never know if maybe your question of reaching out to someone who appears to be in need might save their life and help them gain support that they need. So thanks you guys for tuning in today. Thank you for listening to my story. It's been a big piece of my narrative for the majority of my life, for almost 35 years. And I don't know really who I would be without piece of my narrative. It has been shaped a big piece of me. And it also doesn't define me. Just like all of our life experiences, they contribute to who we are, but they don't define us. And it has been something that has gotten easier for me to talk about. And I don't feel shame about it anymore. I feel comfortable in being able to talk about mental health in a way that's normalized, without shame, without embarrassment, without fear, because I do believe in there's always a choice. I do believe support, even when it feels unbearable, is possible. I do believe that change is possible. I do believe that we can heal. So I guess there was a lot here. Hopefully help you make sense a little bit more of how to process through any emotions you might be experiencing from the recent news of Twitch, how to not judge what we saw on his outside life because we did not have a front row seat to his inside life, how to enter into compassion and not judgment on someone's choices because we don't know where they are in that moment, how to have language to talk to others about it, how to inquire about how someone is really doing, even if you don't know what to do about it. Compassion really means to just sit with. So to be and bear witness to someone's pain is healing. When they say they are not well, to believe them despite all the items they could check off of how their life is going well. Success and mental health are two different things. And to be able to even have language to talk to kids about it, and to not be afraid to talk to kids about the realities of what's going on, and finding language that you can use and make sense of that feels aligned and right for you. So if you have questions, if this brings up anything for you, there's some resources in the show notes. Feel free to reach out to me. Feel free to share this with anyone who is needing to just have some guidance on how to make sense of, again, what I've said 3 times, of what feels senseless, how to grieve, how to mourn, how to not have the answers, and how do we let that be okay. I wish you all a peaceful holiday season. I invite you to check in on others that you care about. And most importantly, to check in on yourself. How am I doing? What do I need? What are my resources? What are my support systems? And always know that help and resources are available to you. And I wish you well. Thanks for tuning in today.
To continue your journey forward, find Jory Rose on Facebook and Instagram to become part of her growing community. You can also gain access to her meditations, books, online classes, or to sign up for an upcoming retreat. Visit her at joryrose.com. That's JOREEROSE.com.